faith confession, we do say that we believe in the holy and ordinary church. That's in our faith confession. Think about that. We believe in a holy, but at the same time, ordinary church. Holy comes from the Greek word hagios, which means separated. So it's about heaven, it's about the holy, but what's holy happens in the ordinary. That's the wonderful mix of church. And that's not two stories, right? But something has happened in the Western culture where what is holy has been eradicated. It's no longer important to us in our culture that something is holy. Holy is gone from our thinking, and we kind of have two stories now. We have the holy here, and then we have the ordinary here. And I'm afraid that contemporary church also has accepted the truths of that we need to stick to the ordinary in order to build bridges to the people of today. So what happens to language then is very important for us to be aware of. We use language that kind of empties ourselves from some of those holy things. Remember when Starbucks came, they taught us to drink coffee differently. They said you can have a grande or a tall. We didn't use those words before Starbucks taught us to order coffee. And I think that sometimes we are fooled by the communication part of what we're doing, and we're emptying some of the language so that we make it very difficult for ourselves in actually saying that we have something very unique that we're offering to this day and age. It's holy and it's ordinary. Let's live in both at the same time, and let's not have two different stories. So what happened, people? Let me show you just a history line here, just to walk through it with you. In Europe, we have two root systems for the way we think in a European context. And the two root systems have been paralleling itself for about 2,000 years. So the sophists, they came with humanism for about 400 years before Christ. They came with humanism. You know, Socrates and Aristotle and all of these Greek thinkers, the humanism that they brought into our thought, our thinking patterns, is an important part of how we understand ourselves ideologically in the world. This happens before Christ. Then Christ comes along. He is in the Jewish tradition. He is the Messiah. He transforms the world through his act of dying and rising again, the Spirit coming, but he also gives us a thought, an ideology to live by. So these two root systems are a part of Western thinking processes. So let's follow the line up there in front. So in the Roman Empire, when Christianity grew like crazy in the Roman Empire, Rodney Stark has written the book A Triumph of Christianity. In year 60, there were about 40,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. 40,000. Year 100, 100,000 Christians. Year 300, 6 million. All right? That's the most conservative number. Coming from a Pentecostal, it's quite a miracle that I chose the most conservative number. But 6 million. About 10% of the Roman Empire were Christians. And Constantine, he said, we're not going to overtake these people. Philosophers at the day during that time, they said, this is crazy. This message is spreading through women, children, farmers, and peasants, and it is overtaking the world. So the people in the ivory towers thought that they were outruled and outnumbered by this underground current of the Christian faith. So in year 300, it becomes a state religion, right? Now, what happens when it becomes state religion? We went into a dark period. We call it the dark 1,000 years, up until the Reformation. Reformation, Martin Luther says, enough of this nonsense. We are going to live by faith, and faith alone. Romans 1, so he has his tower experience. He transforms Europe in many ways. And in our context, in Northern Europe, and from Germany, east towards what is today the Ukraine, up the east parts of Netherlands, parts of UK and the Nordic countries, we were affected by what we call pietism. Pietism was a contradicting a religious move that said, hey, let's not just go to church and listen and not be transformed. If you believe in God, you need to bow your knees and live your life for Jesus. So pietism caused revivals during the 1800s in the Western context. I believe much of that also spilled over to those that came here. And then in the 1900s and up until 2000, we've had pretty strong church, actually, in our part of the world. The bells are ringing. Buildings are built. It's awesome, right? But at the same time, as this is happening in our context, the humanism roots are also here together with us. So we have the Renaissance in the 1400s. That's when all the beautiful art and all the pictures and all the beautiful things that came out of humanism. Some religion in it, but let's just put it on that side to make a point out of it. Then the Enlightenment comes in the 1700s. Now that's where it all changes. That's when the sciences come in and become a major factor in like, this is science. Cause and effect. The world is round. It is not flat. Cannot be created in 6 days. This has, the Enlightenment totally altered all argumentation and started conflicting with the religious ideas of the day and age. What happened then in the large church movements in Europe was that down the hall from the theological faculty, you have the faculty of science, and you have psychology, and you have medicine, you have geography, you have biology, and all of these started working together, and the theologians just finally said, hey, we can't prove it. So what happens then is that the Enlightenment made us accept the fact that man is the measure of all things. And as we were moving into a culture where man is the measure of all things, when we then hit 2000, and of course that's not the year, but when we hit this period of time, secularism basically became the dominant ideology of this day and age. What happens during the Enlightenment and after it, read Charles Taylor if you want to get a really deep look into this. He has written a book called The Secular Age, and he talks about closed world understandings. And he really combats secularism in a very deep and academic way. That's not the place for it to do that today. But I wanted to show you this root system because this is basically where we're at. So I grew up Pentecostal. I grew up in a thinking that let's stay away from the university because then the gospel message will be free. So we put our head in the sand kind of and said, let's just explain the thinkers as idiots and let us just continue on preaching because we will transform the world. And I don't know if that's a good way to go. I do think that we need to engage. We need to be present. We need to accept the mission field that we're in. This is it. This is where we live. Let's not escape it. Let's not look back and say it was better before. Let's engage it today. But my heart bleeds when I see pictures like this from other places around Europe, where churches are turned into hotels and restaurants and skating rinks. It's a terrible situation, but you know what it is? In fact, it is the value system that comes out. Because we would rather go to a bar. We would rather sleep in a hotel, and we would rather go bowling on Sunday morning. And this is the situation of Europe today. In our country, we're fighting like crazy to make sure that every Christian prayer house and building is not sold to another religion. We just have to make sure that there is a strategy in our part of the world to take over the old Baptist church, the old Methodist church. So a Methodist church, they just gave their building last week to a Pentecostal church. And they sold their building for less price to a Pentecostal church plant than they would to a real estate investor. Because we just got to make sure that this does not happen. What I want to do over the next few minutes is that I want to share with you from a text that is a little strange. I said that. And the title of my message this afternoon is, how can we make sure that Gen Z, people born between 1995 and 2010, how can we keep the Gen Z generation awake? On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. As Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where they were meeting. Seated in the window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "He's alive." Then he went upstairs again, broke bread and ate, and after talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. Now, if I was a pastor and people died, I would not write it on my CV as I was going for the next position. But please let me, over the next minutes, just give you some bullet points on some of the things that we have learned we need to put into what we're doing. Number one, friendship. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul had been traveling. He was now in Troas. He's been there for a week. He has 8 people with him, and he now wants to go and hang out with the Christian people in the city. Of course, he wants to get together with those people that are the people of the faith. Late modernity has taught us that we are all individuals. Individualism in itself is not bad. Individualism in itself is a good thing. And individualism can be traced back to financial growth, where the peasant becomes the landowner, send the kids to the school. That's good individualism. Individualism that gives freedom is a good thing. But individualism that crosses over into egoism is a bad thing. So the project in the Western world has been for the last 100 years to see if we can detach people from their history, from their family, and from their religion so that they stand all alone in the world. That's the project. Philosophically, we have 5 things that we all are born into. We are born dependent. We're all going to die one day. We all have existential angst. Relationships are always a little scary, you know? So I mean, these philosophical truths are true about all people. But the thing is that in every culture, we start fighting one of them. You know, some people start fighting, we're going to live forever. Well, we're going to stay young forever. Yeah, we're just going to make sure that the angst of existentialism goes away. But what we have been fighting in the Western world for the last 100 years is dependency. We have said, if you can live your life independent of other people, you will become a free person. So we give them keys to the house when they're 8. We give them a phone when they're 9. We tell them, get your own education, and when you're married, don't be dependent. And we make sure that you should go through life because your independence is your freedom. But sociologists in Europe are saying now this does have a dark side. Because independence quickly turns into isolation, quickly turns into loneliness. And what we're seeing in the world today is an epidemic of loneliness. The way we build our cities in Europe today, we build them so that people can live alone. The apartments are smaller and they're more expensive. And in one of our neighboring countries, they made a movie about the history of love, or the Swedish kind of love. And they will talk about the social services that often will find people in their apartments after 3 months lying there dead because they have the electric bill on auto, they have the phone bill on auto, and even though they live in a high-rise, no one in the hallway knocks on their door when they don't see them. Because we're all going to handle life by ourselves. See, what I believe is that if we're going to counter-culture this, then let's make sure that what we build is communities with great friendships. Let's give the world a gospel-centered, warm church that brings people into friendships. I love the Easter message, but I also love the fact that Jesus says that when 2 and 3 are gathered in his name, he is risen. He stands up in that small group. He arises in that room. Friends, as we are moving forward, let us make sure that we build churches where people want to come together and spend time together. Secondly, Paul spoke to the people. He put time into the conversations. Now, This Dr. Luke, he's writing this message, and as he's writing this, he makes sure that Paul is the main character of the story that he's writing in large parts of the book of Acts, especially from chapter 15 and out. We're looking at him. But Paul, he is having conversations with this group because he's following the model that Jesus had when he met people. When I was a student, I wrote a paper, a long paper on Jesus' teaching methods. That's why I loved you so much what Pastor Byron was sharing this morning. Can you imagine when Jesus comes to the well of Sychar, and he talks to this woman, and she's from another ethnic group. It's in the middle of the day. The sun is on high in the sky. She's a social outcast. Man talks to woman and asks her question, engages in a conversation. And just that story is just a very zoom in on that story. What Jesus does with the woman at the well is that he's showing us how conversations are made so that it changes lives. My old professor, Dr. Humidi, he taught me the conversation is the relationship. The conversation is the relationship. When our youth pastors call our young people, they don't take the phone because kids don't pick up the phone. They don't do audio. They text back or they never text back because that's not how they do it. So I asked some of the young people in our church, how are your guys' conversation skills? You guys remember the fact that you guys have one mouth and two ears? I mean, we need to say this to pastors, but are we making sure that how is the quality of the quality of the conversation says a lot about the quality of our relationships. And I think that we need to make sure in this high-paced society that we make sure that we become great listeners. We come out of modernity into late modernity, where we come from broadcasting through microphones into more narrowcasting in a listening space. My experience is that people that are listened to feel respected. People that feel heard and listened, they feel accepted and they feel loved, and they will come back to that kind of environment. And I think that we as minister leaders, we need to create those spaces where conversations can happen, also without microphones. Because in those spaces, lives will totally be transformed. What Pastor Byron was sharing earlier today, I'm going out of my notes for a little bit, and I'll be back in them for a second. When he talked to us about the two last things that, talking to the crowds, and the two last and the three first, where we kind of ignored, that's a brilliant thought. And I think that much of what we've been doing in contemporary church over the last maybe 20 years is that we've said, okay, we're losing ground. We need to establish contact with contemporary people again. So we've put our focus on the people that do not believe much or are disconnected. But every time you choose a focus, it makes a difference for your methodology. So what happens with the methodology when your focus is to reach out to people that are not connected is that you will do a little more attractional stuff. You'll do some more entertainment. You'll cook a lot of coffee, and your focus becomes your methodology. So if you do social justice, you're gonna have, okay, we see this need. The method will then be activation. People are not taught enough in their head. We will give them knowledge, so we'll set up a classroom. So I think we need to be aware that our focus really has something to say about our methodology. And what Pastor Byron is sharing with us today is, let's continue on with the two last of the five, but let's make sure that we also put in building biblical disciples in our method. So we expand and not narrow what we're doing. What Jesus did when he was here was that he had conversations with people. We have put a strong emphasis on small groups in our church over 20 years. It was my concentration during my master's studies, and I have a picture of a small group here. I mean, just the fact that we sit together and we talk. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. But let's do that. Can you imagine? Jesus taught 16 times. He proclaimed 20 times. He preached 22 times. He asked 303 times. And he answered 144. There is not a page in the Gospels where Jesus is not engaging in conversations. Missiologists and church leaders in the Nordic, I quote Stefan Gustafsson, a Swedish missiologist and apologist right now. We should have, many years ago, added an apologetic understanding to the way we do church. That's something you guys can do now that we should have done better many years ago. We need to catch up now. Because apologetics is about making a defense for our faith. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to answer everyone who asks you and give them reason, apologia and logos, for the hope that you have. In Acts chapter 17, Paul did persuasive evangelism. Now, the results of his speech on Mars Hill, they were not great. But he was not in a churched environment when he was in Athens. So some people want to say, don't do all that kind of stuff because it's not necessary. But honestly, people, he reasoned, he explained, he was proving, he was proclaiming, and he was persuaded. And maybe you guys can do this as a test. Now, these are all verbs about gospel sharing. If we did a test in the Nordic countries, what verbs are we using when we are sharing the gospel in our context? These would not be the words that come up. We would be doing other things. A verb is what you do, right? But this is what Paul did. This is what Jesus did. And I believe that combating secularism, we need to not just be insisting. We need to help our young people have an answer. Because what happens is that as we have two root systems in European culture, what happens is that right now, my kids, they are standing with a cognitive dissonance. They have 2 feet in 2 boats, and you can't remain balanced. Because what happens is that it's so persuasive, the secular thoughts are so persuasive, but in church they teach me that God is alive, but I've learned for 13 years in school that he's not. They say he heals the sick, but they say it doesn't happen. We say he created man and woman, and from man and woman comes the babies, and God continues on creating the world, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, man and wife, babies, but now they say this thing, and they are totally tripping over. I would urge you, add apologetics to the way you build church so that you build strong. Help people have answers for their questions. Preaching. And because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. That could have been some of us, huh? I have so much to say. Sit still. Well, can you handle about 15 minutes more? I'm soon going to close, just in an hour or something, you know? You would never see Tom Cruise do that in Impossible 19, you know, in his movie, you know. This is so much fun. I'll just go on for another action scene. Paul, he spends his time speaking. There was a young boy. He was in church, and then when they left church that morning, he said to his mother, "Now I know what I'm going to do when I grow up." And the mother said, "That's fantastic. You found out what you're going to do when you grow up when you're in church?" "Well, I understand that I'm going to go to church the rest of my life, so I'm going to be a minister." "Wow, yeah, I might as well stand up there talking and sitting here getting bored." Research on speeches and preaching in our part of the world is absolutely devastating. Most people don't get anything out of it. I'm sorry to say. Before internet, 1993, 94, something like that, 20 out of 20 could stand up and have a devotion, and people would listen. Now, maybe 2 out of 20. We need to spend a little more time on the presentation. But we need to make sure that as we're doing it, it still remains full of that word that is the real food that our people need. So what I've said in our church, because I lead the church through preaching, because I'm a preacher, so I lead the church through preaching. Not all pastors do that. Some people lead the church through leading the meetings or managing the church. There are many pastoral roles, but for me, it's I lead through preaching. So I say that our worship service is always for God. That's theologically correct. It is for inspiration and edification of the believers. That's also theologically correct. Then, my last sentence is missiologically correct. It must be interesting and understandable to our friends. Are you with me? So, in ecclesiology, it's for God. It's for the edification and inspiration of the saints. Missiologically, it's for inspiration and it's understandable for our friends. So my wife in her workplace, she made a bet with one of the people who would win a contest about getting in enough contracts. And of course, she always wins. So she won. We picked this guy up. She would have to go to a party and then he would have to go to church. So we picked this guy up early in the morning on a Sunday. And that guy, he had been somewhere, he wasn't prepared, to be honest. So he comes to church and he sits way in the back and I'm preaching and we go and ask him afterwards, so what do you think about church this morning? And he said, honestly, I've never been so attentive listener to something that has no interest to me. Why is that? It's because the gospel can be presented in a way where it hooks people in. And let's never give up on the gospel presentation and preaching the word. And let's never start with what culture says is relevant. Let's start with what the word says is relevant and connect it to what's relevant in the world. This is huge, friends. And we spend a lot of energy on this. I've learned that people don't go to church every week any longer. So I would never do one message for just one week. I would make sure that I pack it into series. Next, it's public. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where they were meeting. One of the criticisms of the early church was that they were cannibals. They would eat the flesh of Jesus, but then that turned into they were eating infants. So they were bad-mouthing these Christians meeting in secret places. So Tertullian, he writes that there were many lamps in that upper room, and maybe that was just because they wanted to say that what they're doing is public. You can show up with a TV camera. They're not cannibals. They're not holy roller crazy people, but they're sane. One of the things I've learned growing up Pentecostal is that when Pentecostalism in its early stages came, it grew among the poor and the marginalized. And it's a beautiful thing that what happened when the Spirit came and the tongues made us be able to communicate with that lower socioeconomic group, it was fantastic. In those early days, there were no psychologists, there were no psychiatrists and people with medicine degrees, people that would coach. So what was left was a scream. It was an emotional reaction. And people, it's 120 years since things started. Let's make sure that we don't badmouth the fact that we come from roots where the marginalized were given an opportunity to cry out to God with utterances that that couldn't be captured in words. That's our Pentecostal history. It's also about emotionalism. It's about helping people in a direction. But one of the problems that has happened, I believe, at least in the 50, 60, 70, on the under 100 churches, is that we combine the private and the public. And that doesn't cut it in this day and age. We have to separate what is it that we do when we are together in a public space and what is it that we do when we have home alone parties. Are you with me? The spirituality that we express in the public room must be a spirituality that makes people understand the fact that, this is the real deal. It's a little strange, but I can handle it. Because when I meet people that once, when they were 16, went to a crazy meeting, and now they're 60, and they've never been back, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's good at all. I think then we are exaggerating. So finding that point of this is enough for the public, and then finding other rooms. In the old European cathedrals, there was always a big hall for the public services, and along the walls, you could go in and have a conversation. You could experience an exorcism. You could go and have a prayer room and contemplate. In the rooms along the sides of the cathedral, there were private spaces. But in the big ship, we were all there because it was public. There were many lamps in the room. We are not hiding away. Stop bad-mouthing us, people. You can come and see if you want to. Our church is a public place. Relevance. Seated in the window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into deep sleep as Paul talked on. And when he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story, and he was picked up, dead. Another theory of the lamps was that the lamps in that room gave out some gas that made people tired. Serious, that's another theory about the gas. Can you imagine Eutychus? He's been working down on the docks in Troas, or he's been, helping people fix their iPhones in a small store. And now he's going up there to listen to Paul, the giant. He's just been to Macedonia. He's coming back with these great pictures on the wall, telling the victory stories. And he's just, he's just falling. I hate that when that happens. That's why they tell us at night here, hope you had a good sleep so that you won't sit here and, that feeling is terrible. So Eutychus, he's like, oh my goodness, it's Paul speaking. So he goes over to the window and he sits in the window and he's like, oh, I'd rather kill myself. And then, no, I don't know. We don't know. We don't know the guy fell out. And then these liberal theologians, they come and they say, no, he was probably just slumbering. Luke is a doctor. Guy's dead. Guy's dead. But there's a slumbering that happens in our culture. Look at this picture. It looks like a bar, but this is it. Between 1995 and 2019, we researched in Norway 150,000 young people about mental health. 2010 to today, mental health has dropped drastically. 44% of young ladies in our country say that they often experience heavy thoughts or dark thoughts in their mind. What happened in 2010? This was invented. What happened in 2011? Snapchat. The world has not been healthy for 10, 11, 12 years, and we can point it to the fact that we are slumbering away in a numbness, swiping. If you're going to get spiritual, you got to be prepared to hone the exercise of attention. Attention is being eradicated in our culture. So we're asking the question, how come our young people are not asking all the existential questions anymore? The thing is that you can swipe away from your existential questions. You don't give yourself the time to tap into. I'm not saying I have a solution, but we do have a diagnosis. This is our problem. We gotta help and be role models. And a Danish theologian, he says it this way: you can't be spiritual if you're not ready to be bored. I have a friend, he works for Google. And they've been there for 7, 8 years now. The Silicon Valley leaders, they don't give their kids phones like this. My Google friends their kids don't have phones. They go to low-tech schools. Play with crayons. They live in low-tech houses. And the rest of us, we get drunk. You know, at one point, we're going to look back at this time, and this is going to be like a pack of cigarettes. It's not good for you. Let's make sure, friends, that what we're sharing today is relevant for the people. Let's make sure that what we call people to enter into is having meeting earth, holy and ordinary. That other software, that other download. Let's be healthy. And then the social medicine people in Norway, they say, hey, leave your phone, go out, do physical activities, clean out your mind. They can say it, and when we say it, we're legalistic. You know, maybe we just need to take back that room. Let's be relevant. Next, power. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. Don't be alarmed. He's alive. And I've been trying to live myself into this thing. I know I've been speaking too long. I know that the clock has been in red, you know, and the technician back there has been threatening me. You go sit down, you never come back here, you know? And then people throw themselves out of windows and kill themselves during service, but I just keep on going. Then Moses raised his staff, and I just keep on going. But then the guy kills himself, and live yourself into this situation. Paul runs down the stairway, and he's thinking, what am I going to do? I forget my first aid kit. So he's looking through church history, Bible history. He thought, Elijah, he had a trick when someone was dead. So he throws himself over the guy, and he's just hiding. He's just hiding. He's not dead, people. Hey, it's fine. But then life comes back into him, and then he goes back up again. I am proud to be Pentecostal, and I am irritated when people say that we are Gnostics and over-spiritual. The Pentecostal spirituality is a very grounded theology. You can ask any old church theologians in the world. The thinkers will say, wow, you guys pray for people when they are poor. You help them prosper. You guys, you pray for people's bodies when they are sick because God cares for the physical body. You guys, you help people out when they have problems with their mind because God cares for the physical. We got to take this back, friends. We got to make sure that we are founded and grounded in a physical world as we are Pentecostals. That's why we're going to make sure when we do digital church, we are not virtual in our faith. We are not neo-Gnostics. We are founded and grounded believers in the fact that we lay our hands on the sick, we pray for physical stuff, and we believe that God can do miracles. Response. Then he went upstairs again, broke bread, and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. I suggest the first order of business when he came up was that we got to look into the air conditioning in this room. Please have really strong Ethiopian coffee before church because I'm going to go on for a long time. I mean, I don't know what he talked about, but he continued on talking with them. When I say response, I want us all to understand this. A microphone is an authority symbol. We live in a day and age after internet. It's one of the largest shifts in the world where democratization of communication happened. Everyone can comment on an article. Everyone can comment on Facebook. That's why we need to be aware, as we are building church in this context, that we in fact listen to the people that wants to talk to us. And we give them results. In fact, it's old school to stand and not listen. That's why I've said the way we do our church is that we preach on Sundays, and we talk to anyone. If you have any questions, we can talk about it. But the response time is the small group coming up on Wednesday. So the whole the sermon is put into a small group teaching where people can discuss. And you know what? We can pick out those misunderstandings. Did he really say? Did she really say? Does she really mean that? And we can just pick out all the misunderstandings. And we can clarify and help out. Response is a very important part of the culture today. You got to find space in the way you build church in order for people to have an opportunity to give responses. In my last minute, the people took the young man home alive, and they were greatly comforted. What was the expression again? Under. You guys taught us this expression, huh? Yeah, it seems like a very underwhelming statement, doesn't it? They were greatly comforted. I mean, we would put it on YouTube and call the TV, and you got to put this on television. They were comforted. Eutychus sat in a window, heard the story of Paul the giant, how he had built the church on a missionary journey. He falls out of the window, dies, he's resurrected, and suddenly when he comes back up again, it's no longer the story of Paul that is his story, but it is his story that becomes his testimony. We can fire up our churches through fresh experiences with Jesus. Build a catch system in your church where you catch the stories and the testimonies and zoom in on them and let ordinary people share their experiences. Because how are we going to overcome? The blood of the Lamb and the power of our testimony. So what we're going to see now, we have 120 years of Pentecostalism behind us, but it's not over yet. Because we live now. We can put the strategies straight now. Imagine if we can see a generation of Eutychuses that of course we come, but somehow we're awoken to be a part of what's happening, and we can be a part of what God is doing today. Thank you so much for your attention.